All right. This week's Sedra is Parshas Vayishlach, and Eisav, Yaakov sends malachim. There's a machlokes, whether it's malachim mamish, as Rashi says, or it's messengers, because the word malach could be agents, to meet Eisav, to, in a sense, open up communication, I guess, with Eisav. And Eisav apparently seems very rude to the Malachim, and he gathers an army, and Yaakov is told by the Malachim that Eisav is running with his army towards him. And Eisav and Yaakov is overtaken by fear, and he makes all kinds of preparations. L'duran, he makes a mincha present to Eisav, and he said, even to the Malachim, he referred to Eisav, Adoni Eisav, my master Eisav, and L'tfila, he davens to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Katonti mi kol hachasad mi kol emes, hatzileni do miyadach miyad Eisav, save me from the hands of my brother, from the hand of Eisav. And then there is the battle between the malach of Eisav, the sorrow shel Eisav, the ish, and Yaakov. And then Eisav comes, and somehow, all of a sudden, Eisav's attitude changes completely. One reads just the beginning of the Sedra. You're expecting a war to break out, a battle to take place. And judging by Eisav's military ability, Eisav had a lot of experience in killing people, and no doubt his soldiers were also involved up to that point in all forms of battle. You would have expected that the result, b'derech hateva, would have been in a great catastrophe taken place to the house of Yaakov. But all of a sudden, it changes. Vayishlach lo. He kisses him. There was all kinds of discussions in the Medrash, whether he meant to kiss him or he didn't mean to kiss him, whether it was fraudulent or it was sincere. But clearly, there was a change in Eisav's attitude. It went from the perspective of, I'm going to kill Yaakov, and almost with determination that when Yitzchak is gone, he's going to kill Yaakov, to all of a sudden, even showering Yaakov with offers of protection. And of course, Yaakov tells Eisav that he doesn't want the protection. He should go his own way. Eventually, he'll meet him in Har Seir. But the question is, what was it? Why did Eisav change his mind? Now, the Mefarshim, the Ramban, and the others, on this Sedron, explaining the meeting or the confrontation between Yaakov and Eisav, they very much emphasized the idea of Maisav Osimim Labanim. Because in future generations, there are going to be many Eisavs. And somehow, looking at this Parsha will serve as a blueprint on how to deal with the Eisav of the generations. Matter of fact, I remember when Menachem Begin was Prime Minister of Israel, and he had to meet with the President of the United States. I don't know if it was Carter or Reagan or Bush, whoever it was. So, and he had a meeting at that time. There were meetings because he had formed the government and he needed the support of Agudas Yisrael to form the government. And so he met with Rav Shach, and Rav Shach told him that before he goes to Washington, so he should learn Parshas Vayishlach. In other words, Parshas Vayishlach is always used as the guide how to deal with leaders of outside the Jewish nation who are dealing with the Jewish people. And now but in order to, my Sabo, similar button, the deeds of the Avos will serve as a blueprint for the bottom for future generations, for their sons. Now, when we take a look, so we have to understand what is the concept of being an Av of Klal Yisrael entail, that we should say Maisa Avos Siman Labanim. Now, when we take a look at Parshas Toldos, Eisav purchases the Bechorah from Yaakov. So what does he give Yaakov? He gives Yaakov, what does Yaakov give Eisav? Yaakov gives Eisav Nizir Adashim, a bowl of lentil soup, red lentil soup. I know there are those that have problems with that because lentils are usually brown. Okay. Anyway, but he gives Yaakov a bowl. Yaakov gives Eisav a bowl of lentil soup. And the question is, Eisav was not stupid. Eisav was not foolish. He was very smart. So how is it that he is ready to sell the Bechorah, the birthright, to Yaakov for a bowl of lentil soup? Now when we take a look, now in the Parshas Chayesara, the Torah tells us that Avram sent Eliezer to find a wife, to Paddan Aram, to find a wife for Yitzchak. And the Torah, the Chazal tell us that the Eliezer asked Avram, maybe, Ulai, the woman will not want to go to Eretz Canaan. So should I bring Yitzchak to her? And Avram says no, but the word ulai, perhaps, is written Eli, to me. In other words, Eliezer was concerned. Eliezer wanted Yitzchak for himself, for his daughter. And there was a certain logic to his argument. After all, she was brought up in the house of Avram. his daughter, was brought up in the house of Avram. And it was a house where no one worshipped Avodah Zarah. No one worshipped idolatry. It was a house of chesed, a house of kindness. And where was Rivka brought up? Rivka was brought up in the house of Psuel, a house of idolatry, a house where they took instead of gave. And why should Avram prefer Rivka for Yitzchak than his daughter, who was brought up in Avram's own house? And Avram said that you're Oror, you're cursed, because he was a descendant of Canaan, who was cursed by Noach to be servants, to be slaves. And my son is Baruch, is blessed. And there cannot be a union, certainly a marriage union, between Aruch and Baruch. And we have to understand, what does that mean? It doesn't really answer the question. Now, it's true, my uncle suggests that Avram, when he left Padan Aram, when he left Charan, he always left like a religious underground, a little bit like the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe when he left Russia, to keep the faith going, to teach chesed. And Rivka was influenced by this religious underground. And Dvorah, the Meinekes, that dies in this week's Sedra, she was part of that religious underground. And she was the one that instilled fear of God, a desire to do chesed. In Rivka, and we can say in Rachel and Leah, there were others who were involved, left over from the group that Avram Hanefesh Sharasu B'Charan. There were people left over. And that's why my uncle says the Torah in this week's Sedra focuses on the death of Dvorah. Actually, why was Dvorah so important? But the answer is because Dvorah was the one who gave over the midos, the traits of Avram to Rivka. And in a sense, she helped perpetuate the tradition of recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu combined with chesed to all of man. But the question still remains. After all, Eliezer's daughter was brought up in the house of Avram. Now, by the Akedah, the Torah tells us that Avram, when he went to the binding of Yitzchak, so he took Shtei Na'aravito. he took his two servants. He took his two servants with him. And the Medrash says, the Daskeni Balatosfos mentions the Medrash. Who were the two servants? And the Medrash says it was Eliezer and Yishmael. And the Medrash says, Vayaras hamakom merachok, on the third day, Vayi bayom hashlishi, Vayaras hamakom merachok, it was on the third day. And Avram saw the place from afar. And we could, so Marah, what did Avram see, the Medrash says? Har Noah, he saw a beautiful mountain. Va'anon kashor aleha, and a cloud attached to it. I think we could suggest that the cloud attached to it was the cloud, perhaps, that a heavenly cloud, the cloud that was over the Mishkan, the cloud that was over the tent of Sarah, and undoubtedly that same cloud was over the tent of Avram. So, Vayaras Hamakom, and we couldn't understand Vayaras Hamakom Merachok from a drush perspective. Hamakom, that's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Makom is one of the names of God. Makom represents the midah of God, of providing a place for man to contact him from afar. So Vayaras Hamakom Merachok, so he saw this heavenly cloud over Har Moriah. And he turned to Yitzchak, the Medrash says, and he said to Yitzchak, what do you see? And Yitzchak said, I see Har Noah. I see a nice mountain. Va'anon kashor aleha, and a cloud, which I interpret to be a heavenly cloud attached to it. Then he turned to the Shnei Narim. He turned to the two servants, to Yishmael and Eliezer. And he said to them, Ma tem roim, what do you see? And they said, we don't see anything. So Avram, according to the Medrash, said to them, you sit here with the chamor. You sit here with the donkey. And we will return to you. And he added, he says, the chamor doesn't see anything, and you don't see anything. And we have to understand this idea that the chamor doesn't see anything, you don't see anything. And the Daskeni Balatosfos, there are some contradictions in the Gemara in Dushin, but the Daskeni Balatosfos says that here is where we learn out that an Eved, a slave, does not have yichus, does not have halachic pedigree. His child is not considered his child. His father is not considered his father. So the question is, what is the Medrash telling us? What is the Medrash telling us? And I think what the Medrash is telling us, that Vayaras Hamakom Merachok, that Avram saw Gilu Shechina from afar. Eliezer was a great man. We say Kaftzalo Haderech, when he was on a mission from Avram, the road became smaller. All kinds of miracles took place. When he met Rivka at the bear, Avram entrusted everything that he had to Eliezer. Moshe, he governed over his whole house. And still, he was not able to see the Gilui Shechina. How are we to understand it? But the answer is, it was Meirachok, from afar. Eliezer only saw what was directly in front of him. It's very interesting. The Medrash tells us that at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, Rasa Shechina Alayam, the maidservant, I discussed this in an earlier share, the maidservant at the sea, saw more Gilui Shechina, more revelation than the prophet Yecheskel ben Buzi. Now, the prophet Yecheskel ben Buzi, we all know what happened with him. Some of the greatest prophecies about lost and Lavo, about the future, are given over to him. But what happened to the maidservant? Let it be the Jewish maidservant. What happened to the maidservant at the sea? And if it's the Jewish maidservant, she was probably involved in all kinds of rebellions later on. But there's no special impact from her. Why is she called a maidservant? Because everybody was a slave in Egypt. But it's obvious that the slave has a certain servile perspective. A slave has no concept of a past and no concept of a future, because his future is not in his hands, and very often he is sold, he is taken away from his master. He is taken from one task to another. He's taken by his master, away from his parents. So there is no connection between past, present, and future. The slave only has control, and his main focus is on the present. And because of this, Eliezer, while he could see the Shechina when it was right in front of him, where was the Nefesh Asher Asu B'charin that Avram took with him to Eretz Canaan? What happened to them? But there is a medrash that says the two pshatim brought down Nefesh Asher Asu B'charin. One is that it was the Avadim, the servants of Avram and Sarah. And the other says it was the Gerim. Gerim at that point did not mean real Geris. Probably meant a Ger Toshav, recognizing HaKadosh Baruch Hu and basic laws of morality. But what happened to all these people? Okay, they were loyal to Avram. I always had a theory, I don't know if it's true, but I read an article that the archaeologists, when they dug to the lower chamber of the Maras Machpelah, in one room in the lower chamber of the Maras Machpelah, they found bones of people that dated back to the time of the Avos. Many, many. And I was always wondering, perhaps these were the bones of the servants of Avram that wanted to be buried near Avram. But in any case, Where are their descendants? But the answer is, you could be fully committed to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to the Torah, but if you don't have a perspective of the future, if it's not Vayaris Hamakom Merachok, if you can only see God in the present, so Shvulachem Poem Achamor. You have to be here with the Chamor. To be an Av of Klal Yisrael. To be an Av of Klal Yisrael, you have to be able to, or an aim or a mother of the Jewish people, you have to be able to value the future. And Yaakov, Avram knew that the one perspective his family didn't have was this: they did not have a serval perspective. Eliezer was a giant of faith, but he was a servant. He was a slave. He was Arur. And the future of Klal Yisrael can only be built by an Av and an aim, by a mother and father that have a perspective of the future. You know, today, parents, when they go to graduations, they want to see the honors that their children are going to get at the graduation. But that's the present. A true parent is more concerned about what is going to happen in the future to the child. When you evaluate the success of an educational program, it should not be evaluated on the basis of the number of merit scholarships that were achieved. It should be evaluated on the basis of what the likely outcome will be years from now. And because that is the true meaning, certainly from a Jewish perspective, of a mother and father, a focus on the future. And that's what, so now and Eisav was certainly no slave. But Eisav also, his main focus was on the present. And early on, it was on the fleeting moment of the present. When the red lentil soup was in front of him, and he had to choose between the red lentil soup and the Bechorah and the birthright. So Eisav viewed it from the perspective of the present. Eisav es ha-Bechorah. Eisav looked down at the Bechorah. He ridiculed it. He said, why? Anochi holech lamas. I'm going to die. V'lama li Bechorah. What does the birthright manifest itself primarily in what's going to happen to future generations? I won't be there then. I want the present. And I am ready to trade the future that I will not be part of for the present in which I am. And because of that, the lentil soup at that moment became more important to him. And we should really ask ourselves that question. How often do we make Eisav's mistake? I'm not giving Mussar to anybody else. I'm giving Mussar to myself. Sometimes when something is right in front of us, it makes a bigger impression upon us than much greater things of the future. And sometimes we trade the future for the present. And I mentioned the Brisker Rav in the previous year regarding the pasuk in Yoshua, Ve'etein la'Avram es Yitzchak. I gave Avram Yitzchak, Isaac. Ve'etein leYitzchak, and I gave Yitzchak Isaac, as Yaakov, Jacob, as Eisav, and Esau. Ve'etein leEsav es Har Seir l'Reshes also, and I gave Eisav Mount Seir as inheritance. The Yaakov uvanav yardu Mitzrayma, and Yaakov and his children went down to Egypt. And the question is, what do we care? First of all, the Brisker Rav says, who cares about Eisav? You're talking about the history of the Jewish people. And then if you do mention Eisav, why don't you mention Yishmael? And the answer the Brisker Rav mentions, I mentioned it before, because Yishmael was excluded from birth to be the successor to Avram. But Yaakov and Eisav had equal chance, but only one of them would be the successor. So the pasuk in Yoshua wants to show that Yaakov became the successor because Avram was told, your descendants will be foreigners in a land that is not theirs, and they will be enslaved. And then they will first be able to form their nation. Whereas Eisav, so the Torah wants to prove that Yaakov, the pasuk in Yoshua wants to prove, if Yoshua wants to prove, that Yaakov was the chosen one, because Eisav starts his country right away. He starts his nation right away. Yaakov, before he starts his nation, he undergoes exile and slavery. And the question is, why did it have to be that way? Why is it that Yaakov had to undergo, Yaakov and his descendants had to undergo servitude, exile, torture before they could start their nation, whereas Eisav is able to start his nation right away? And there are three answers that come to mind. I've mentioned it in the past. One answer is, and I think this plays a role in the Haggadah of Pesach, there's a difference between sympathy and empathy. When you have sympathy, so you feel bad for somebody, but you don't feel his pain. Empathy is you feel the person's pain. You feel his pain, and more than that, and sometimes that's the bigger test, you feel his joy. That's empathy. So as a matter of fact, I think that's why in the Haggadah we say the Holaf Manya. Why do we say start the Pesach Seder with Holaf Manya? So one possible answer we could give is because we talk here about Shibud Mitzrayim, the enslavement of the Jew, and the delivery from Egypt, and the formation of the Jewish people as a nation. But the question is, why did the Jew have to suffer so much? Okay, it was like the Haggadah says, it was like God told Avraham, but why? Reb Chaim would say we can't ask why, we'll ask what. What is the lesson to learn from this? But the answer is, the Jewish people, Rachmanim, Baishamin, and Gomle Chasadim. What are the traits of the Jewish people? The traits that they learned from the Avos, from the patriarchs. The Maisa Avos, Siman Labanim, is feeling for somebody and having that feeling help the person. When we see somebody in difficult straits, it's not enough to feel bad for him. We have to feel his pain. This was why the Jewish people had to go down to Egypt. Because by going down to Egypt, we were able to identify the experience of Egypt, which was thousands of years ago. When we have the Maisavo similar Banim, we can identify with the pain. Thousands of years later, we can feel the pain. It's not just something that happened to somebody else. But there's another reason. Actually, two other reasons. And the two reasons, I think, are related one to the other. The Jewish people, as opposed to the other nations of the world, were to be an eternal people. Eternal people. An eternal nation. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Yaakov had to choose between the present and the future. All the other nations, when they encounter difficult circumstances, when they underwent exile and slavery and torture for generations, so they crumbled as a nation. But the Jewish people alone were able to survive as a nation, as a people, in spite of these difficult circumstances. Why? Because they encountered it in their foundation as a nation. Their foundation as a nation before they really became a nation, before they had a country. And so this is why we're able to survive. But the question is, what was the perception? And that's the third reason. It was to emphasize the perception, the self-perception of the Jewish people. What was the perception of the Jewish people while they were in Golus and while they were in Egypt? It was difficult for them to see themselves as a nation. But the answer is, they saw themselves as a family. When we want to be an eternal people who will overcome exile, when we have no land, we have to be able to see ourselves as a family. If we see ourselves only as a country, as a nation, when the country is taken away from us and we're spread all over the four corners of the globe, if not for that feeling of familyhood, we would cease to see ourselves as a nation. But what very often happens, is that people feel that seeing themselves as a family takes away from their perception as a nation. And I think that perhaps this might have been Eisav's feeling. Eisav was concerned that Yaakov would see himself as the head of a nation. And in a sense, there would be a competition. Who is the nation? Yaakov or Eisav? But Eisav, seeing himself as a family, took away from the perception of being a nation. Eisav, who was interested in the present, he wanted the nation now. And he also he might have seen Eretz Canaan as his homestead, as the place where his family, before he moved to Har Seir, was. But Eretz Canaan was not his nation. But so long as in the present, Yaakov only saw his group as a family and people who helped out the family, who worked for the family, who were servants of the family. But it was basically a family, not a nation at that point. Eisav was not so concerned because Eisav was only concerned about the present. And it is interesting that Chazal point out to us that the way the Jewish people encircled the Mishkan, camped around the Mishkan, was the same way that the Jewish people wore around the coffin of Yaakov when he died. And the question is, what is the lesson to be learned from that? But what very often happens is that so long as the patriarch or matriarch of a family is alive, the sense of familyhood is still there. I have to say that in recent times, even that has become weaker. But I remember as a young boy, came Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Yom Tovim especially, Pesach especially. You saw the grandparents, the parents, the grandchildren. They came from all over to be with the grandparents. They must have slept on the floor. There's no way in the apartments of Manhattan, which in those days were somewhat larger than they are today, that so many people could have stayed there, except that they slept on the floor. But so long as the matriarchs and the patriarchs were alive, there was a sense of family. But figuratively, the last time that sense of family is there is at the funeral of the patriarch or matriarch. But by the Jewish people, that sense of family had to continue. So the same way they were circled around the coffin, carried the coffin in the same order that they carried the coffin of Yaakov. They camped around the Mishkan. In other words, part of the idea of the Beis HaMikdash was for the Jewish people to maintain their identity as a family. And it's very interesting. So even though they were a nation, but it was a nation based on familyhood. And it's very interesting. The Medrash tells us, Torah says, there were 4 flags besides the flags that each nation had. Each camp, there were 4 camps. Each camp, one camp on each side of the Jewish people, of the Mishkan, of the Mishkan. And each camp had 1 flag, besides the individual flags that each Shevet had. And 1 flag had Aleph Yud Yud on it. The second flag had the letters Beis Tzadik Ayin on it. The third flag had Reish Ches Kuf on it. And the fourth flag had Mem Kuf Vase on it. And the question is, what's the idea? But if you put these letters together, you get the words Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. In other words, when you have all the Jewish people together, the parents are still alive. When the family stays together, the ancestors are still there. So when the Jewish people were around the Mishkan, they were a family. And when they were a family, to a certain degree, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were still there. Yaakov understood that for the perpetuation of the Jewish people, it was important that the idea of nationhood should not negate the idea of familyhood. And it's a very interesting medrash. The medrash tells us in this week's Sedra, he says when Hamor approached Yaakov, that he wanted to create a shidduch between Dinah and his son Shechem. So he said to him, he says, she is a granddaughter, okay, a great-granddaughter, whatever. He said a granddaughter of Avram. And Avram was a Nasi. He was recognized as a prince. And Hamor said about himself, Ani Nasi haaretz. I am a Nasi of the land. Basically, he was saying, I'm interested in yichus. I'm interested in yichus. I want to be related to the family of Avram. And the Medrash says that Yaakov, or Yaakov's sons, answered him, you're a chamor. You're a donkey. And Avram was a shore. El habokaratz Avram. By the 3 malachim, when the 3 visitors came to Avram, Avram was doing chesed for them, was showing kindness, giving them to eat. And he ran to the cattle. Somehow that turns him into like a shore. He says, and the halacha is that you're not allowed to plow together a chamor and a shore, a donkey and an ox. My uncle, I saw him, I brought down my uncle's name. He says, it's a medrash pliya. How are we to understand this medrash? My uncle explained it, I think, in a way only he could explain it, but I want to change it a little bit. But I'll tell you how he said it. He said, we see from various Gemaras and various Psukim that a chamor, for the main part, what does it do? It carries things. It carries things. A shore for the main part was used in those days for plowing. My uncle was talking about about tzedakah. He said people give tzedakah. He said about American Jews. He said American Jews give a lot of tzedakah. In those days, educational institutions did not do so well. The people gave a lot of money in those days to home for the elderly, which was very important and is still very important. Of course, we have to conduct it in a manner that will be beneficial for the elderly, not to have the home for the elderly as the steps towards to the funeral parlor, but the people gave in those days. That was the popular tzedakah, and people should support that. It's very important. But for educational institutions, my uncle said they didn't give. My uncle actually mentioned the story. He said he once went to a man and he asked the man to give money for a day school. And the man said, "What do we need a day?" And this was a man, my uncle said, he used to sit and learn. You have to realize America in the 30s was somewhat different than it is today. The man in the 30s, he said, and was a person, he said, was in the Chevra Shas in those days. To be in the Chevra Shas, to learn, I mean, how many people even opened up a Gemara? So I remember when we moved to Chicago, not every house had a Chamisha Chumshei Torah, and I'm talking about the Orthodox Jews. I'm not saying there weren't, but you couldn't see Sfarim. In many of the Orthodox houses, not to talk about a Rambam, and a Shas. But this was a man who learned Gemara, but he had a different perspective. He said to my uncle, "What do you need? What do you need a day school for?" So my uncle said that the children should be able to learn. I assumed they had Talmud Torahs. In Talmud Torahs, they learned Chumash. My uncle said, but they don't learn Gemara. He says, what do they need to learn Gemara for? He learned Gemara, but he didn't see it as something that was important for the future generations. So my uncle said it wasn't just the learning of Gemara. When you learn Gemara, it gives a person a different perspective for the future. Anyway, years later, the man came to my uncle and he said, my son is engaged to a non-Jewish woman. He was very upset. And he asked my uncle to help him break the shidduch. Well, so my uncle told him something that obviously was not true about the time of Hamor and Yaakov, and not true today. But in those days, the Jews, for the most part, were immigrants. My uncle said, go meet your mechutin, the future mechutin. He said, don't worry. After your future mechutin meets you, he will break off the shidduch. So my uncle used the expression, he was a real Yankee. So that's what happened. But my uncle said, but you see, the question is about the son, the perspective that the son had. Today, it's not true. Today, on the contrary, it's like in the time of Hamor. You're a Nasi. I'm a Nasi. This is a proper shidduch. They have that. Today, it's different. But okay, in those days, it was different. But in any case, my uncle said, day schools was very hard to get money for. Why? Because they didn't see what was done, what was accomplished. The accomplishment was years later. The accomplishment was years later. So my uncle said, that's what a shore. A shore represents the future. Plowing. You don't see the results of the plowing when he plows. A chamor collects things on his back. You see what he has. He said, when Avram did chesed, he was concerned also about the future. I want to add another point. When Avram did chesed, he was doing chesed. He was teaching not only his generation, but that's the idea of Ma'isa Avo Siman Labanim. Yeah, Avram was concerned about the future. When he did chesed, he was teaching not only his generation, but generations, thousands of years down the road. And it's interesting, the Medrash tells the Ramban asked the question, what was the purpose of the Akedah? HaKadosh Baruch Hu certainly knew that Avram would pass the test. And the Ramban says, Lahotzi mehakoach ala poel, to take it from the state of the potential into the state of the actual. I just want to add, when you can't teach future generations by the potential, what I could do, what I'm capable of doing. You only teach future generations, and you only teach future generations with the poel when it's done. That's Ma'isa Avo Siman Labanim. But other people, first of all, they're not interested in the future generations down the road. They're interested about their children and their grandchildren. And they're not going to be there. Anochi holech lomos, as Eisav said. V'lama li b'chora. What do I need it for? I won't be part of it. They won't know me and I won't know them. But Avram was teaching. Avram understood, first of all, because of the Masorah and because the Torah kept the Avos alive, kept the patriarchs and the matriarchs alive. So they continue to teach Torah throughout the generations. When they acted, they weren't acting just reacting to the situation of their generation. They were reacting to the situation of the future generations as well. Ma'isa Avo Siman Labanim is to tell us that the Avos, when they acted, they weren't just acting because of the situation they found themselves in. It wasn't just because of the situation that necessitated to teach their generation, but it was to teach all future generations. Eisav was only interested in his generation, Anochi holech lomos, when I'm alive. And he saw that Yaakov's main interest was the future. To him, there was no conflict. And because of this, Eisav changed his whole attitude. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat. You mentioned other times, or let's say in Parshas, what is it, Va'era, when Moshe told Bnei Israel about Besoras Haaretz and Besoras Habanim, that they bowed down.
Yeah.
Thank Hashem. So is that because at that time the Bnei Israel had that sense of future, and therefore the fact they were going to have children, they
That's
realized
right.
children weren't going to be slaves, and
Yes, that's correct. They were, well, they weren't going to be slaves, and that there was a future that showed that they were sort of weaning themselves off from slavery, from the perspective of slavery.
okay. Is there more we should be learning from Devorah, since we're only told about her now and her death?
Yeah, okay, but in other words, but I would assume because Dvorah acted as a underground, so the Torah keeps her secret until her death. It was an underground; it was hidden.
There's an interesting Chizkuni from 2 weeks ago that some of the people who went with Rivka, one of them was Devorah. It's almost like you've mentioned the story that the Chafetz Chaim needed a passport, or he didn't have a birth certificate to get a passport. So they said, if you get someone who's, who can testify when you were born, right. But he was in his 90s already. So Chizkuni mentions they sent Devorah because she could attest when Rivka was born. It sounds like that Chizkuni was talking about the birth certificate that the Tsarist Russia needed in
Okay.
thousands of years later.
Okay, but Avram was concerned because you see, Eliezer was concerned. Al mishpachti. Avram told Eliezer al mishpachti, so he needed someone to confirm that was mishpacha.
Okay.
And we rely on doctors in the hospital to say who the baby is. So I guess she was like the doctor. Okay. Well, and also Avram knew her because if she was part of the religious underground, as I call it, so Avram, they realized that Avram she apparently was close with Avram.
But according to the Yerushalmi, though, they learned from Peretz, from the sons of Tamar, that the midwife was only believed at the time, not later. I think.
Okay, yeah, but here Eliezer. She was a part of.
Right.
She was part of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There are more people like Devorah. Why did they not convert?
Well, maybe she did convert.
But her job was not to stay with.
That's right. Maybe she did convert.
There aren't any other questions here.
Okay.
So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay. So next week we'll probably a little bit about Hanukkah also. So we'll see.
Okay. Thank you. Shikach.